All right, everyone. This is Dr. Cedric Michael Simmons, and I am so excited to share a presentation that I am calling How 4DX Helped Me Be a Better Nerd for Justice. So, why Nerds for Justice? For the last, I would say, 15 years, I have been focused on one primary question. And that question has been, what does it look like to continue the tradition of people using their intellectual skills, using the things that we learn in school to promote justice? What does an effective approach to that look like? And for my friends and for my family and my colleagues who have known me over the last 15 years, you know that this question has been something I've been struggling with, have been focused on. And part of the reason why I love sociology and part of the reason why I embraced not only getting an undergraduate degree in sociology, but actually getting my PhD in sociology was because I felt like it gave me the best tools to grapple with the question of how to better understand and address injustice using those skills that I have as a nerd. I wasn't always a nerd. I didn't always embrace being a nerd, but it was in college when I learned and really not only learned about, but also became a part of a bunch of communities who felt like it was their responsibility to continue the tradition set forth by the civil rights movement or embodied by the term servant leadership. And as somebody who identifies as Christian, that meant a lot to me because I was taught growing up that one of the best ways to express our faith and to show our faith as Christians is to be like folks like Dr. King, to be like folks who were part of the civil rights movement, who felt like it was not only something they should do because of their interests to put forth and to organize collective resistance to racism and what have you, but they felt like it was their spiritual duty to do so, even when it was hard, even when they were not successful. So, sociology was my home in college, where I learned that there was a bunch of other people who were trying to do similar things, even if they didn't have the religious content that I had as part of that, or the spiritual foundation or content for them. So, one other thing that you should know about me is that when I was in college, I was actually a student who was homeless. So I ran away from home my senior year of high school. And for a bunch of different reasons, in many ways, I call it and consider it to be my first protest. But I was really, um, although I was homeless, I really wanted to go to college. And I remember praying for the chance to go to college because I wanted to learn how to address at the time this tendency of people to believe that it is not appropriate or it is not worth one's time or it is a waste of time for someone to prioritize addressing racism, especially because at that time, a lot of people made it seem as if racism had somehow evaporated because Barack Obama had been elected president of the United States. So it was when I got to college that I started to really act on that faith after having really many nights praying that I would get the chance to learn how to address both racism and the myth that racism didn't exist, but also to be able to bring those skills back to the place that I grew up in because I love the place that I grew up in. I love the town that I grew up in. When I was homeless, a bunch of people took care of me. Teachers, especially, took care of me, and administrators. And so I wanted to essentially be a servant leader back in the hometown that I was in. And I can say, although I'm a professor now at Nazareth, for the last 4 years prior to me taking this job a month ago, I got to do that. I got to be the director of equity in my hometown, in the school district that I went to school in, and I felt like I added value because of my sociology degree. And I'm not going to lie, it was also pretty cool to show that somebody with a sociology degree can do well outside of a collegiate setting. And I was able to make more money than I ever thought I would ever be able to make, especially not by the time I was 30. So it was I learned a bunch of things from that time, and I feel so blessed to be able to bring the lessons that I learned there now back to the classroom as a professor. So this image of Nerds for Justice is really I'm working on a book right now, and this image is my best attempt to capture with a logo or something the spirit of that tradition that I feel like I'm trying to be a part of, and also is part of my new mission, which is to get other Nerds for Justice together to figure out how can we help each other be better, even in the wake of resistance from what I call the anti-equity movement, or some people call the anti-civil rights movement. Because I do believe that the tradition of civil rights enforcement, the tradition of anti-discrimination, the tradition of unionization as a tool for social justice, I believe that that tradition is worth preserving. And I want to figure out how to do that with other people. So I hope you like the image, and please give me feedback too, because I think that this is going to be the cover of my book. So when I say a nerd for justice, basically you are a nerd for justice if you have the spirit of this belief. And that's, I want to keep learning about injustice and the most effective paths to social change, even when it's hard and even when it's scary. I made it clear that it's about wanting to keep learning about, because what I've noticed is that adults, a lot of adults who I've worked with, people who I think are brilliant, people who I think are passionate about equity, diversity, inclusion, what have you, it's almost as if they, some of them, or many of the folks who I've known, it's almost as if the piece about ongoing learning somehow gets left off to the wayside. So, in other words, I've noticed that a lot of people will say that they care about injustice and they don't know what to do, but are not as quick and as willing to take the time that it needs to figure out how to actually do that effective. So the people who want to rush to the solutions and don't want to get into the pit of learning about effective action, those are the people who frankly do some damage. But the people who say we want to actually make sure that we use our brain power to understand what we're up against and figure out effective pathways to that change, those are nerds for justice. So if that is you, then you are a nerd for justice. So that can be educators. I know a ton of educators who I would consider to be nerds for justice. I also know a ton of educators who think they're nerds for justice, but do not necessarily want to go into the learning pit. There are social scientists, there are researchers, there are sociologists who are nerds for justice. There are student leaders of clubs and organizations. There are leaders of committees. There are community organizers. There are faith leaders who care about justice. If you can be any of those things and be a nerd for justice. So those are the people I'm trying to reach out to. The primary audience that I care about, though, especially with this video too, is since I am a teacher, and since this is a video that I'm sharing with my students, I care deeply about the next generation of college students and young professionals who want to figure out how to do this well. And I want to share some of the lessons that I learned from the mistakes that I made over the last 15 years. Here is my mosaic, if you will, of examples of people who I consider to be some of the best nerds for justice that I've interacted with or learned from, whether it be in their writing or whether it be from their modeling of their action. So on the top left, I'm just going to go from across the board. So you have Zaretta Hammond, who's the author of Culture Responsive Teaching and the Brain, one of the best books, I think, of all time. You have A. Philip Randolph, a civil rights organizer and one of the architects of the March on Washington, on both of the March on Washingtons. You have Reverend and Dr. William Barber. You have who is the leader of the Poor People's Campaign. You have Sean McGuffey, who's a professor from Boston College and one of the advisors of my dissertation, and one of the smoothest and coolest methods hungry people that I've ever met in my life. Ellen Berry, who's written, I think, what I consider to be the best books on both recognizing some of the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and also some of the pitfalls and the problems with that work, especially The Enigma of Diversity. I think that's one of the best books of all time. Dr. Adolph Reed Jr., he is somebody, I think I've listened to every single podcast that he's been a part of. I've tried to read every single thing that he's written. I think he is probably one of the most brilliant minds, political scientists of our age. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had a degree in sociology, I might say, but everybody knows who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is. I would highly recommend reading the autobiography of Dr. King, so you can realize that actually, in many ways, Dr. King was a lot closer. His politics were a lot closer to somebody like Bernie Sanders than some of the other folks who claim to embody the spirit or to want to continue the tradition of Dr. King. Christopher Emdin, who wrote this amazing book called Ratchetdemic, and I've seen him speak a number of times, and he is just a gifted educator of educators. Professor Zine Magubani, who is also one of my advisors from when I got my PhD at Boston College. She is somebody who took hours upon hours helping me understand some of the limitations of my approaches to social justice and analysis, and somebody who is widely recognized as a brilliant historical sociologist and global sociologist. Kathy Groutman, who was the former superintendent of the school district that I used to work at and that I went to school in, and she was my boss for 3 of those 4 years that I was there. She's the person who hired me and probably one of the most gifted leaders I've ever seen and was able to learn from. Toure Reed, who is, funny enough, the son of Adolph Reed Jr., and he wrote this book called The Case Against Race Reductionism, Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. And when I read that book, I felt like I was not alone for one of the first times intellectually. I felt like I was not alone in my thinking, and he was able to capture some of the things I was trying to say a lot better than any of the ways I could come up with. And then lastly, probably one of the GOATs for intellectuals, Barbara Fields, who also is a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, and she wrote this brilliant book with her sister Karen Fields, rest in peace, called Racecraft. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, and I alluded to this before, and I'm not trying to promote any type of religion or anything like that, but my path and my interests also stem from my faith as a Christian. And I believe that that when I'm trying to do this work as a nerd for justice, I do believe that I am trying to follow the path that we're supposed to follow as Christians. And I genuinely believe that that I am answering that question, at least to the best that I can with the skills that I have, of what might Jesus do. So one key question that I've heard from a ton of my fellow nerds for justice who I worked with in my previous job, from students, from educators, from organizers who care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's this. We've done the training, we've done the anti-bias training, we've done the book studies, but what do we do now? What do we do now? And this is especially true for the nerds for justice who realize that one major barrier to injustice, or one major barrier to justice, actually, may be the tendency for people to believe that the way that we're going to get out of or address injustice is just to run everybody through a training. And it's almost as if people believe that anti-bias training is almost like the Ozempic for racism, that it's a shortcut where somebody does a training, does this quick training, maybe it's 2 or 3 days or maybe it's even 4 days, and that somehow discriminatory practices, discriminatory attitudes, um, discriminatory behavior, that racist attitudes, what have you, that they're just going to go away as quickly as Ozempic seems to be as an effective drug for dealing with folks who want to lose a bunch of weight. And I included the image of Robin DiAngelo from the book, the author of the book White Fragility, not because I'm saying that she was promoting that belief, but more so I bring that because a few years ago I noticed that a bunch of people read that book, White Fragility, and came out thinking that if they could just do a white fragility training, or if they could just be, or if they could bring Robin DiAngelo to their school or to their place, or if they could be a discount version of Robin DiAngelo at their workplace or at their school, that somehow all the problems that they see are going to go away. And then over time, they realize that it didn't work. And some of them believe that, oh, it didn't work simply because folks were too fragile. But what I've noticed, especially in the last year, is that there is a collective understanding, that there seems to be a growing understanding, that perhaps the method of expecting people to come out of a training going, I was colorblind and now I see racism, that accepting that maybe that wasn't the best strategy or the best method, and we need to question, why did we think that that was somehow going to be the solution for some of these major complicated systems levels issues that exist related to instructional equity, related to culture responsive education, related to restorative practices, and what have you. Not saying that education and training is unimportant, but more so recognizing that somehow having a few trainings is going to solve all these problems. That is the tendency that needs to be disrupted, that I try to disrupt, and I think people are actively disrupting. So one of the lessons on how to address this question of what do we do after the book studies and after the trainings, what do we do now? One of the answers to this question that comes from sociology really is, you got to focus on the lip service problem. And the lip service problem is the tendency of leaders of organizations, whether it be board members, whether it be senior level administrators, whether it be corporate executives, whoever, saying the right things, saying that we need to fight injustice, we need to promote equity, but it not actually matching up with changes to practices and changes to the systems or anything structural in the organization. So the lip service problem, in other words, is folks basically saying some of the right things, but the saying and the words not actually matching or being followed up with the necessary or even significant changes to the distribution of resources or to how decisions are made. So the 4 books that I have up there as examples are either written by sociologists or informed heavily by sociological thought. And so when I started my job as the director of equity, for example, I made it clear to everybody I knew that as a director of equity, my default position is that people will say the right things, but there's a gap between the intentions and the words and the actual practices on the ground. In other words, people may even have the attitudes, but it's actually the changes in behavior, it's the changes to structures that actually produce the outcomes that we care about. And that is where the difficulty lies. How do you close the gap between what organizational leaders say about justice and what is actually done? Recognizing the limitations of the approach of me being an administrator who is trying to close the gap between what gatekeepers, administrators, and powerful people say and do as a part of the system. So I was clear with everybody. For example, you may not have, or you may distrust me because you see me as part of the system. That makes sense. That makes sense. I tell people all the time, I don't know of too many social change movements that have been successful that was led by managers and bosses. I get it. but I just kept trying to approach it as and be clear that my main objective is I will not contribute to lip service. I will not contribute to window dressing. Instead, I will make that the primary problem. How do we address the lip service problem? And if you are down to work with me and to work with the folks who I hired or the folks who were part of my teams, if you're down to try to figure out how to close that gap, then we're good. And I will not overpromise. So that's nice and all, right? It's nice to say we have to address the lip service problem, but how does one do that, especially when you are a teacher? When you're not an administrator, when you are not a board of education member, when you're not one of the gatekeepers in the organization, how do you actually address the lip service problem? So that's when I was told, well, that's not when, but I think it was about my second year in the job. So this is 2 years ago. One of my friends and colleagues told me to read The Four Disciplines of Execution. And the book is, when you look at it and you learn about the authors, like they're not sociologists. So I didn't go in thinking that this is going to be something that's going to help me address a major issue that equity advocates, that directors of equity, and that Nerds for Justice are going to, like, it's going to be helpful for them. But I read it in good faith, in part because the person who told me to read it, which shout out to Dr. Christine Baker, I trusted that if she said it would be helpful, if she said that it was worth reading, then I would take her up on that. Especially because if I want people to follow those steps, if I want people to read something or pay attention to something that I think is important, then I also need to do the same too. So trusted her, picked up the book, read it, and my mind was blown. My mind was blown because it summarized some of the major things that I learned about, and that I learned from experience, from mistakes, about social change in trying to advocate for justice as a student activist, as somebody who was a teacher, as somebody who was a member of a unionization effort when I was in graduate school and working as an instructor. It had so many lessons from that in one place, to the point where I just thought, I wish I had this book sooner. And here's what I'm just going to give my quick summary of what the book says. So the Four Disciplines of Execution basically says that if you are a team that wants to be successful in reaching their goals, you cannot focus simply on trying to change the hearts and minds of individuals. And you cannot assume that if change doesn't happen, it's just because people are too stupid or just not interested. Instead, you have to assume that part of why change does not happen is because people are really busy in the whirlwind of their everyday lives, of the work that they have to do. And anybody who's trying to organize knows that's true. A huge barrier is trying to get folks who are busy, even people who have the same mindset and core values as you, or at least say they do, that a big barrier is people are busy, and it's really hard to let go of, or it's really hard to escape the whirlwind to do new things, especially when there's always so much incoming of people saying, you should try this, you should try this, you should try this. And another assumption of the book is that if you want change to happen, one problem that organizational leaders make and teams make is they focus so much on these big, broad goals. They put a lot of money in putting these goals out there, and they put a lot of attention on the outcomes, but they don't put that much attention on the methods that they will use to produce the outcomes that they care about. And when I read that, my mind was so blown, because sociologists talk about this problem all the time. They talk about it in terms of thinking about the actual mechanisms or the methods or the processes that produce change. That it's not enough to have the intent and then just try to see over time, did the outcome change as a function of the intent or the function of the goal? is that you have to actually have the right processes in place to translate the intent into the impact that people care about. And so they said in the book, the authors argue that we focus so much on these lagging indicators of the goals that we care about. But if we don't actually have the right methods to produce the outcomes we care about, then we're going to keep spinning our wheels wondering why is it that we're not getting the outcomes that we care about. And so there's four vital components that they have. One, if you want to address that issue, one is to focus on the wildly important goal. Focus on that one goal that the team is going to be organized around, and it has to fit a very clear format of where we're at versus where we want to go by a certain time frame. So if you do not have a goal that says I want to go from, let's say, 190 pounds to 180 pounds by July 1st, 2026, like you need to have a clear format of that, because if you just say, I just want to lose weight, or we're just going to lose weight, that's too vague. That's too ambiguous. And it doesn't actually, set a foundation for you to be able to then go to the next steps you need to be successful. So focus on the wildly important goal and say that, and make it clear that that wildly important goal is important because of the interests and the needs of the folks who are part of the team. So we are a team because we have the same wildly important goal that we're saying that although our whirlwind, although our tornado of so much work that we have to do, yes, that's important, but with the limited amount of time and space and brain power that we do have that's left, we are going to devote it to that wildly important goal. The second thing is to act on the lead measures. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that after this. So don't focus on those. Don't just focus on we have the same goal, so let's just act on the goal. No, you have to focus on what are those things that we can do that's going to produce the goal, and act on those steps, act on those methods, and be clear about what those methods are. The third thing is to keep a compelling scoreboard. That scoreboard has to show, or has to be clear, and it has to showcase both the major goal that we're trying to reach and the indicator of that goal, but also it needs to help us be able to keep track on whether or not we're doing the things that's supposed to lead to the goal. Because if we're not doing those things that's supposed to lead to the goal, then why should we expect the outcome that we want to actually occur? And then lastly, create a cadence of accountability. And what that means, broadly speaking, is if you want to reach a goal, and if you want to work with other people to reach that goal, you need to set clear times and places where you're going to meet together to figure out and process, have we made progress? If not, why not? What do we need? And if we have made progress, let's celebrate the fact that we have made progress. It seems so simple, and people say it sounds like common sense, but I loved learning about this because even though it's quote unquote common sense, it ain't common practice. So here's another way of thinking about those four vital components. So first, you have to have a clear goal, clear measurable goal. I'm going to go from an F in this class at midterms to an A in this class by the end of the school year. Very clear goal, as opposed to I'm going to do well in this class. A clear goal. The second component, the lead measures, think of those as the major money moves. Not just what are the things that we could do, but what are those things that we as a team say that if we do these things, we will be successful. It's one thing to say, there's just a million things you can do to try to make money, but we're saying these are the most important things, the most important steps that we could take in order to reach the goal of whatever that goal is that we have monetarily. If you want to make $1,000 by next week, these are the most important things that we should do and that we want to keep track of us doing, and things that are in our circle of control. The third thing is an easy to read scoreboard. So it's not just having a scoreboard that just has a ton of things on it. It's having a scoreboard that's easy to read, that I can look at it for 30 seconds and know, have we made progress? Have we not? And then lastly, for the cadence of accountability, just like when it comes to losing weight, or just like when it comes to doing well in class, one of the best things that you can do to make sure you make progress is to make sure you have at least one other person who's going to meet with you to talk about whether or not you're making progress, whether or not we are making progress, and what can we do to be successful. An accountability buddy is so important, or accountability buddies. So examples of lead measures. If you are in my class, if you are in a sociology class from Professor Dr. Cedric Michael Simmons, and I say this all the time in my class, there's a few things you have to do. You have to do the reading. You have to attend class. You have to take notes. You have to review notes. If you have questions or concerns, or if you just want to process things more, you have to come to office hours. And then leading up to the exams, you have to actually practice exam questions, which I share in my class, and you have to study for the exam. You can't just show up just from taking notes and doing the reading and attending class and expect to get an A. You have to actually review those notes before you get to the exam. And then lastly, if you do make mistakes, you have to view those as opportunities to learn. So if you do those things, those are some of the major money moves that can lead to you being successful at getting an A on your exams in the class. As a teacher, I also share with my students, and it's on my syllabus too, is that there are major money moves for me as a teacher. So one of the things that I'm expected to do is, in order to be successful and help you be successful as students, is I need to understand the toolkits. I need to understand the cultural resources that you bring in to understand the world. So I'm a part of a different generation. If I don't understand how you make sense of the world as students, then it's going to be really hard for me to be able to teach you well. And I have to not only understand my students' worldviews, but I also need to respond positively. Just because it may not make sense to me doesn't mean it's dumb. And if I respond as if it's dumb, or as if it's ignorant, or whatever, then why would you then want to listen to anything from me that you haven't heard or understood before? The next thing is, I need to take my understanding of your pre-existing knowledge as students and connect that to the information that I want you to learn. That's why metaphors and stories and analogies are really important to me. And then as a teacher, I can not only give you the reading, but I have to create spaces for students to process the information. That's why having a classroom is so important to me, because our job, I'm not just going to give a lecture of all the things that are in the reading. I'm going to create space for us to grapple with and to process what is it in that reading that we just read, or how can I make ties between what we just did in the reading today to what we learned previously, because that's what's going to make it sticky in our brains. And then I need to balance my care and showing care for students also with high expectations, because if I lower expectations simply out of care, then you're not going to rise above what the risk of what could happen is your brain's not going to grow from no push. So if I have high expectations and I push you to reach high expectations along with the care, then you are more likely to be successful. And then if I make mistakes, or if I do something that could potentially erode some trust, then I need to restore that trust. But I need to build trust before I restore trust. So finding ways to build the rapport with students and make it clear that this is a learning relationship that's worth your time and energy as students, I need to build the trust that it's worth your investment, so that if I then need to restore trust, I have a foundation that's already set, just like any other good relationship. I need to be a role model. As if I say learning and ongoing learning is important, then I need to also do that myself. And then lastly, I know that I need to cultivate some sense of joy in the classroom. There has to be laughter. There has to be fun. There has to be engagement, because that also helps to make the new learning stick, and it provides a sense of safety for when we talk about difficult topics. So these are the major money moves or the lead measures that I take seriously as an educator. So when I started my job as a director of equity, and over the years of doing that job as director of equity, and then also based on the 15 years of studying sociology, there, and I should also add, many years of working with and working up against administrators trying to advocate for social change despite resistance, has told me that there are six major things that are really, really, really important if you're trying to advocate for change, especially as a teacher or as a student leader within the system. One of those things is you got to find your people. And when I say find your people, I mean you got to find your people who have similar core values. So when we say justice, we actually know what we're talking about. We have similar priorities, and we need to get each other, find my people, and then get us all in the same room together just to help us understand and see that we have similar core values. So just like at a college orientation, where part of the function of it is to build a sense of community so that when you get to the learning in college, you have your people. You have to do an orientation with folks who have similar priorities when it comes to justice. The second thing is, if you are going to advocate for some type of systems level changes, organizational changes to gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers could be senior level administrators, they could be board of education members, they could be at schools, they have these things called school improvement teams or shared decision making teams. You have to find a way with your people to show solidarity with the gatekeepers before you advocate. So think of it almost like in a lawsuit, you have to get standing. The way I see it is get standing with the gatekeepers before you start proposing some type of changes that you want them to accept. So one way to show solidarity with the gatekeepers, for example, is I find my people, I find my fellow nerds for justice. We figure out what is some dilemma or some issue or some problem that we have that we also believe that the gatekeepers have, and then do a summit, do a meeting with our two groups and say, hey, we have a similar issue. And then make the case that it would be beneficial for them, for our group, our Nerds for Justice, to come back down the road with some proposals for organizational change. Because what I learned is that if you don't show solidarity beforehand and you just try to advocate out of nowhere, then what's going to happen is the gatekeepers are going to dismiss what you're saying simply on the grounds that we didn't ask you to come here and give us these things. We're busy. But if you demonstrate solidarity and get some standing and get some agreement that it would be beneficial for all parties involved for your advocacy, then when you come back down the road and advocate for the changes and push for the changes, you can simply say, we kept our promise. So show solidarity with the gatekeepers before you advocate. Third thing, understand the problem with a variety of groups, which includes the people who are struggling with the problem, before you rush to the solutions. So for example, if the issue is, let's say, I'll give a common issue that I worked with in my previous job. Let's say that you have an issue where teachers are saying things and doing things to students of color, for example, that students of color are viewing as disrespectful, and the teachers view it as, well, we're unintentionally doing it and we didn't mean to do it, you're coming at my intentions, what have you. Before you try to advocate for change about how to address that issue, make sure you understand the complexity of the issue by talking to the teachers and talking to the students, and also looking through what are some of the other reasons why this problem is hard to address. Because if you rush to the solutions, you're going to be proposing remedies without a complicated understanding of the issue, which means the remedies probably won't work. It's almost like somebody trying to solve a car issue without doing the inspection first. Why would you try to solve a car issue without trying to understand the complexity of why is it that a car may not be starting? Then, after you have an understanding of the problem, then you go to try to look for what's the buffet table of potential remedies that could be on the table, and not just look at books or look at articles or research, because that is important. Scholarly research is important, books are important, but also talk to the folks who are involved, because sometimes they have some good ideas that maybe was dismissed or not taken seriously from the gatekeepers of the past. Or if you're talking about students, students sometimes have some really good ideas, but folks never ask them. So, or to their parents. So look for remedies from a variety of groups. Then, once you have that buffet table of potential solutions, you then need to basically almost have like a Shark Tank, where you have some people, let's say 2 or 3 people, just like in the show Shark Tank, who view it as their responsibility to push back on the potential ideas that you have on how to solve the problem, to figure out which ones are the ones that will pass the scrutiny of the gatekeepers. So whether it's the Shark Tank or whether it's, I call them red pens, because think of like a red pen on a red pen using, or a teacher using a red pen to grade, or think of it as when you're typing on a Microsoft Word document or a Google Doc and you get that red squiggly line. Sometimes it's unclear what role can the folks who are critical like that, what role can they play? And this is a good way. They could be the sharks. They could be the Shark Tank to help make sure that as a group, the remedies that we propose are actually going to be high quality and surpass the scrutiny of the gatekeepers. And then lastly, use the skills and the tools of really good culturally responsive teachers to advocate for those changes to the gatekeepers and to organize. And so when I say organize, what I mean is don't just go to the gatekeepers and do a presentation and say, here's what our ideas are, and then hope that it's going to produce the outcome you care about. No, organizing is figuring out what are those things that we need to do to expand the population of people who support our remedies or support the things that we're advocating for. And with other things that we care about, we would never risk putting all of our eggs into the basket of a presentation. No, we'll talk to them before. Even if you want to do a presentation, talk to them before. Ask them what are some of their thoughts about the potential ideas. Ask them for some advice about how to best frame the ideas so that when you want to advocate, everybody will understand what you're talking about and they'll see it as a win-win. And the best culture responsive teachers are people who know their audience and know how to present new information to that audience. And labor organizers know this too. One thing that perhaps I think some of my DEI folks may not put forth as much as the union organizers who I know is that union organizers know that if it's in the self-interest of people, then you should probably make it clear to them how it's in their interest to pay attention to you and to pay attention to the things you're advocating for. Begin with the premise that the audience is believing, why should I care and how does this benefit me? Not just how is this going to help me be a better person or how is this not going to show that I'm not a hypocrite? No, how does this actually benefit me? And rather than viewing that as an obstacle that is insurmountable, begin with the premise that it's your job as an advocate and as an organizer to demonstrate how it's beneficial for them and for you, and that really the mutual gain is the reason why we're having this conversation, as opposed to me trying to sell something to you solely for my gain. So to use a case study as an example, when I got to my job as a director of equity and as a sociologist who didn't know much about public school education, what I did know was that we had these equity-oriented committees and teams at a bunch of the schools in the district, and they called themselves Guardians of Equity. So I decided, with the team of folks who I was working with, a bunch of teachers and administrators, decided to really lean into the Marvel aspect of the theme the Guardians of Equity. So instead of Guardians of Galaxy, we're the Guardians of Equity. And my wife helped me create the logo. And then my point was that, okay, we have the Guardians of Equity, and we have these teams that want to be successful advocates, but they're struggling with how to do so besides the training and besides the book studies. So we're just going to upgrade. We're going to go from the first level to the volume 2 of the Guardians of Equity. And so using what I learned from the 4 disciplines of execution, I thought it would be really cool to create a scoreboard that also fit into the theme of the Marvel universe. So I thought of the Infinity Gauntlet from the Avengers movies. And I thought, I wonder if I can create a scoreboard that that leads to an equity gauntlet that captures the different components of what they need to do to be successful and can make it a little bit fun and fit into that theme. So all those 6 steps that I mentioned, the orientation, the identifying a dilemma that is plaguing your people and the gatekeepers, doing the inspection of the problem before you run to the remedies, then doing the remedies research, quality control, that is the Shark Tank, and then doing the education with the organizing, I decided to show or to take those 6 steps and make those the different gems on the gauntlet. And so if you look at the center, the wildly important goal is to go from no equity gauntlet to a complete equity gauntlet by a certain time frame. And each of the components are the different gems. So instead of it being the soul gem, or instead of it being the space gem, or what have you, any of those infinity stones, these are the gems or the stones that can make up the equity gauntlet that will help to increase the power of the team to be successful advocates. So just like when you have the gauntlet complete, you become incredibly powerful. This is how the team goes from feeling powerless to feeling powerful. And so the orange stone was the orientation stone. The purple is the dilemma identification stone. The red is the problem inspection. Blue, remedies research. Yellow, quality control. And green, education with organizing. And so then what I had was I asked the folks as part of the teams to agree to color in the different gems when they were successful and to sign it. So that I got that from online, from a coloring book. Basically said, when we're done, we're going to color it in and we're going to sign it as part of our celebration because we were successful in our attempt to go from no equity gauntlet to an equity gauntlet. And to be culture responsive, I tried a bunch of different things to be culture responsive with teachers. So one of those things was to say that as the equity team, you are almost like consultants. So as the Guardians of Equity, you are receiving, or you have a dilemma that's tied to the goals and priorities of the gatekeepers, which is the school improvement team, the SIT team. There's a dilemma that is tied to your goals as an equity committee and their goals as school improvement team. And then as consultants, your job is to take that dilemma after we agree that it's legit, and then come back to the gatekeepers with research and recommendations about how we can collectively address the dilemma. So that is a learning partnership instead of it just being an arrow in one direction. And then the analogy I used was, imagine you're at a wedding where you have a couple who wants to get married and they have a vision of their wedding day. There's always going to be some dilemmas, some issues that come up in the process of getting married. So who's going to take that dilemma on? The equity team is kind of like the staff who works at the wedding venue. So the equity team is gonna say, while you're continuing in your whirlwind of reaching your goals, let's say the dilemma is, or the issue is that we agree upon is a catering company decided to cancel the last minute. You keep doing the things you have to do. We'll take that issue if we agree it's worth taking on, and then we'll come back to you down the road with some recommendations based on research about how it would be beneficial for you to take these steps, and you will know that it's worth taking because it's mutually beneficial. We did our job as the planners, as the wedding planners, and as the consultants to help you get married. And if you don't like it, and if you feel like it's not mutually beneficial, then let us know. But we kept our promise to come back to you with good research and recommendations. Another approach that I used was to let the folks know that, yeah, there are some issues that are understandable when it comes to trying to be a successful equity team. One of those was that when we were trying to do work, we weren't clear about what our core values were. So we say equity, that can mean a bunch of different things. What does that mean? This gauntlet, this process helps to address that issue. Another thing is that if a lot of people were being asked to be facilitators of teams geared towards social justice, but it's so easy to get stage fright because it's scary out here. It can be really risky to be the person who is front and center saying that I'm going to advocate for social justice and social change. So it was clear that facilitators of these teams need coaching and they need protocols. And so that was my job, and the folks who I was going to hire, that was going to be our job. A third barrier to success for equity teams was that it was unclear what the relationship between the equity team and the gatekeepers was, especially at a time when the equity teams realized and learned that we needed to do more than the book studies, and we need to do more than the trainings, and show how the work that we're doing is beneficial to the system as a whole. And then lastly, demonstrate that the protocol could be helpful because one barrier to feeling powerful as an equity committee is folks not knowing how to respond to myths and pushback in productive ways. So when people say some things that are not true, part of the function of that protocol that I shared and part of the function of getting that equity gauntlet is to learn how to respond to the myths and the pushback. And that's why that quality control phase is so, so important. That's when iron sharpens iron. Another way that I talked about it, a third way, was look, if you want to be successful in getting people to support a campaign, let's say running for student government or running for presidency, you have to not only have your core values and tell people if they agree with you, they need to vote for you, but you need to persuade them. You need to organize them. You need to organize votes. You have to get people to want to get out the vote. So if we assume that there's going to be a vote on the objectives that we care about, on the recommendations that we care about down the road, let's do all the things that we know that's going to get people more likely to want to vote in support of those recommendations. So just take the strategies of campaign organizers and apply that to address some of the issues with related to equity. And if we take that approach, now that means that we have to actively figure out how can we persuade people to go from not supporting our campaign to going to support our campaign. That becomes one of the main objectives, as opposed to just saying people aren't supporting our campaign, what do we do? No, make that the key question, and then let's learn about it as a group together. And a fourth way that I tried to make the distinction clear was to say, in the Guardians of Equity, in the committees, there's a bunch of people who do really good work with charity. There are people who do a lot of good work with advocacy, with lobbying and recommending steps, like doing the nerdy parts of like, here's what should be done. And there's a lot of folks who are really good at getting people who already agree with them to show up. But the part that was missing, and the part that we need to build our skills on, was learning how to find out who's the population of people who also disagree with us or who don't understand what we're trying to do, and have a protocol and have clear steps and clear strategies to approach them like campaign organizers with one-on-one conversations to persuade them to go from anti or neutral to pro the steps that we believe folks should take. So rather than viewing that barrier as, okay, there's nothing we can do, let's make that the primary objective of the equity team. And organizing or mobilizing is just getting the folks who are already in support of your core values or your objectives and getting them to show up to a meeting, whereas organizing is about targeting the folks who say, I'm not a supporter, I'm not an activist, and bring them into the fold. that distinction between organizing and mobilizing was brilliantly articulated a um, by a scholar and by a union organizer, Jane McAlevey, in the book No Shortcuts. She recently passed away, but I would highly recommend that if you find any videos, any YouTube videos or books from her, I would highly recommend you read them, even if you're not a union organizer, because she she does a really good job at explaining organizing to folks who have a wide array of things they're trying to address, which includes folks who care about social justice in a school district, for example. So I'm not going to go into crazy detail about each of these things, but I wanted to make sure you have access to the slides so you can pause or what have you if you like. But each of the steps, I didn't just say, oh, at first I sort of put it out there broadly with the objective, but I worked with a group of teachers to figure out what are some of the key questions that we can put forth for people to so that you know you are successful and ready to move on to the next stage of the protocol if you can answer these questions. So during the stage where you assemble for orientation, or you find folks who, when you find your people, you want to do things like answer questions like, how can we find the people who are also struggling with this dilemma? And then what could we do to persuade them to put the work in, even if they're busy, worried that committees or teams are a waste of time? For the dilemma identification, questions that you should understand are things like, what is the connection between the dilemma that we're struggling with and the official goals of the gatekeepers? How would they benefit from our equity team or our equity committee or equity task force presenting research and recommendations down the road? And what can we do to make sure that our case for that partnership is persuasive to that audience? For the inspection, who do we want to talk to and what methods could we get that information from? What type of questions should we ask and what pre-existing research on this dilemma, on this question, on this issue exists that we can study? And then answer similar questions, but about the remedies instead of just the problems. Quality control, how do we go from a bunch of recommendations to 2 or 3 really good recommendations? What are some protocols or strategies we could use to filter out the great and not so great ideas and solutions? And what type of Shark Tank role-playing exercise could we use so that we can prepare for any questions, criticisms, or pushback? And then lastly, what would a culturally responsive presentation to the gatekeepers look like? How can we demonstrate that the gatekeepers benefit from the adoption of these recommendations before, during, and after a formal presentation? And what could we do to ensure that the gatekeepers embrace the responsibility to see our recommendations happen? So if you are able to answer those questions, part of the role of the team meetings is to figure out good answers to those questions and to practice applying those answers to those questions. And to make it plain to folks, when I was in that job, I also provided presentations where I highlighted, here are people who are models of the spirit of that stage. So the place I worked at with Greece, I provided examples of teachers and staff and administrators in that district who folks will recognize as being really good at doing work as work related to orientation. And then also I provided a pop culture example. Dr. King, really good at making clear what the core values are and mobilizing people to get on the same page about what we're trying to accomplish. And then in the Marvel movies, Captain America played that role. So for each one, I did the same thing. Sherlock Holmes, he's somebody who's really good at dilemma identification, and I can't remember his name right now, but Samuel L. Jackson's character as an example of the dilemma identification. Chef Ramsay and Oprah for problem inspection, and Spider-Man because of Spidey senses, and Miles Morales for problem inspection. Dr. House and Hermione for coming up with ideas to remedy an issue, and Black Widow, one of the best spies in the Marvel movies. And then I have Zaretta Hammond as an example of really good at quality control. And then I also have the characters from Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder. They're really good at going from a bunch of remedies for an issue to really, really good steps in the right direction. And then from the Marvel movies, I have the two most brilliant minds in the movies. You have Dr. Banner and Iron Man. And then for the organizing piece, getting folks who may not agree with you to come into the fold, I had the Obamas as the pop culture examples. And then I had the Black Panther as the example from the Marvel movies. And then, of course, kept stressing that because it's part of the four disciplines of execution too, as part of our accountability. When we make success, when we get points on the scoreboard, we celebrate when we got points on the scoreboard. And to be clear, for the 40X nerds who are not only in that room, but who are watching, we did have the from X to Y by win. So we said our wildly important goal would be something like by July 2nd, we will go from 0 to at least 2 recommendations for whoever that target group is, those gatekeepers, on how they can address the following equity dilemma. And the dilemma could be something like, we will come up with recommendations to address the dilemma of how to address microaggressions from teachers. Or the dilemma could be something like, how do we get anti-equity board members to realize that equity is about high quality instruction? But it has to be a dilemma that both the gatekeepers who you're trying to convince to adopt the recommendations and accept the recommendations, that they also agree is a dilemma for them and would be mutually beneficial for them to make progress on. And then I shared the scoreboard as an example at those meetings, and just really tried to organize around the fact that we can do this and we can make it fun. And the cool thing at the time was that we were going to be able to have a cadence of accountability where we were going to have these coaches who I had hired until the Board of Education decided to change their minds essentially and get rid of the positions. But we were going to have folks who were going to be the accountability buddies for the facilitators of equity teams at the elementary buildings. And then folks who are going to be support for the secondary buildings, so the high schools and the middle schools. And we're going to have monthly meetings where the teachers who are the facilitators of the equity committees, they would facilitate the meetings at their buildings, but we would co-facilitate with them if needed. We would meet to update our scoreboards. If they needed a substitute so they could have time to plan the meetings, then one of us would be the sub so they can peel off to the side to get their work done if they needed to. And then we would do a lesson because we are teachers. And we would also give them a pre-packaged set of slides and agendas that they can change up if to their liking for their meetings at their particular school. So we had a holistic approach to providing high quality support with that accountability so that all of us could be successful. That was the plan that we're going to implement this year holistically, and not just at some of the schools like we did the previous year. We're going to implement that across the district, but for some of the decisions unfortunately made by the Board of Education in my previous job. And then I was going to have monthly meetings with the deputy superintendent and the superintendent to provide the updates. I was going to be a part of the meetings related to the school improvement teams, and then we were going to celebrate the success that we made. And I share that not to say, oh my gosh, that's so sad that we didn't get to do that. That's not my point. I just wanted to show this is what a cadence of accountability, a strong cadence of accountability looks like. So to summarize, if the key question for my fellow nerds for justice is what do we do besides the training and the book studies, whether you are my college students, whether you're leaders of student organizations or clubs or teachers or educators, what have you, my argument is you need to form groups to address the lip service problem. You have to begin with the premise that, yes, the folks who are anti-social justice, yeah, you want to do things and focus on how to address that dynamic, but actually, as the starting point, you need to form groups that begin with the premise that there's a gap between what gatekeepers say, what leaders of organizations say, and what actually happens on the ground. And sometimes we contribute to that gap because we think we know it all. But so the purpose of the group is to address the lip service problem that the sociological research says is a major problem when it comes to social justice commitments and rhetoric in organizations. But once you have that team, you need to use the four disciplines of execution, the 4DX model, to promote collaboration and teamwork for success. I made it clear that the major money moves that you have, those lead measures, need to be based on research on social change and organizing, because those major money moves are what's different from the training and the book studies. You also need to make it fun and make it culture responsive. So I shared a bunch of different ways that I tried to sell it to people. And I also shared some of the mistakes that I made. But really, the more fun it is and the more it's understandable to people, the more likely they're going to buy in. And then lastly, this is my last point, that the beautiful thing about this is not that you can expect that all school improvement teams, board members, cabinet members are going to take your recommendations and implement them tomorrow. You should actually assume that that there's a good chance that won't happen. But the cool thing about this is it gets those gatekeepers into the learning pit. When you create that standing with them, you are taking away ignorance as an excuse for inaction. I'll say it again. So many leaders of organizations can say we have a gap between our intent and our impact, not because we don't care, but we don't know what to do. So then the function of these steps, the purpose of these steps is to close the gap, or really to address the ignorance that folks have about how to close the gap. So then we can now come back to the table and say, you have the steps on how to close the gap between your intent and your impact. So there must be something else besides ignorance that's going on, and we need to deal with that too. So I hope this was helpful for you all. I did not expect the four disciplines of execution to be such a big part of the work that I did as an equity director. I thought I was going to come in as a sociologist and do my research, but the four disciplines of execution helped me to be able to translate some of the things I was trying to say and some things I learned to the teachers and to the students I cared about, even if they didn't understand the steps completely at first. It then gave me a foundation to be able to talk about and make the case that these are the steps that we can learn about and take in order to be successful. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a blessed day. And I hope you all see, especially my students, that you can be Nerds for Justice too. Thank you.